The river wasn't supposed to look like that. I've lived near that stretch of water my whole life, seen it swell in spring, run quiet in summer, but that morning it had a color to it, dark and churned up, moving faster than anything had a right to move. I heard it before I even stepped outside, that low, heavy rush, the kind that fills up the air and makes you stop walking. I grabbed my boots and went down to the bank without thinking much about why. Sadie was already at the door. She'd been restless since before dawn, pacing the kitchen, stopping to look at me and then back at the door. I didn't think anything of it. Dogs get like that sometimes. You chalk it up to the weather or instinct, or just one of those mornings where something in the air doesn't sit right. I let her out ahead of me. She ran, not the playful kind of run, not that loose, happy gallop she does when she spots a squirrel. This was something else, straight and deliberate, down the slope toward the water. I called her name once. She didn't even slow. That's when I saw it. Out in the middle of the current, maybe 30 feet from the bank, there was a branch caught up against a half-submerged log, and on that branch, something small, something dark, moving. At first I thought it was debris, a clump of leaves or a plastic bag caught in the current. But then it shifted, and I saw two hands, little hands, gripping with everything they had. I don't know how to fully explain what happened next, because I didn't tell Sadie to do anything. There was no command, no hand signal, nothing. She hit the water at a full run and didn't stop. The current knocked into her immediately. You could see it push her sideways, but she corrected, angled her body upstream, and kept moving. I stood there on the bank and I couldn't make a sound. My voice just left me. The thing on the branch was a gorilla cub. Couldn't have been more than a few months old. I wouldn't know that for certain until later, but even from the bank you could see it was young, the size of it, the way it moved, uncoordinated and desperate, all instinct and no strength. It was losing its grip. The branch was shifting in the current, rotating slowly, and every time it moved the cub adjusted, clinging, its small body pressing low. It let out a sound I've never forgotten, not a scream, more like a question. Sadie reached it. I watched her get close, close enough that the cub must have felt her in the water beside it. And then something happened that I still think about when I'm lying awake at night. The cub let go of the branch. On purpose. It reached out and grabbed onto Sadie's back, both arms, and it held on, like it knew. Like somehow in the middle of all that cold and noise and water, it made a decision. Sadie turned back toward shore. I could see the effort in her now. The current was fighting her harder with the extra weight, her head dropping lower, her rhythm breaking. She'd go a few strokes and lose ground, then dig in and gain it back. I found my voice and started talking to her, just saying her name over and over, quietly, the way you do when there's nothing else you can offer someone except the sound of you being there. They reached the shallows. Sadie's paws found the bottom and she lurched forward, dragging herself up onto the muddy bank. The cub was still holding on, wrapped around her back, its face pressed into the wet fur at the base of her neck. She stood there in the mud, breathing in big heaving pulls, and she didn't shake the cub off. She just stood, still, patient. I started toward them, and that's when I noticed the other side of the river. Through the tree line, across the water, there was a stillness that didn't belong. I stopped walking, counted, 5 of them, maybe 6, large dark shapes at the edge of the trees, standing at the bank on the opposite shore, watching, not moving, not making a sound, just watching. I didn't know what I was looking at, not all of it, not yet, but I knew enough to stay where I was, and I knew that whatever came next we were right in the middle of it, me and Sadie, and that cub still holding on with those eyes on the other side of the river, deciding something about us that none of us had any say in. One of the larger ones stepped forward, moved to the edge of the bank, and it looked directly at us. The large gorilla didn't rush. That was the first thing I noticed. It came down the bank on the other side slowly, deliberately, like it was choosing each step. Then it entered the water, and it wasn't wading, it was walking through, steady and low, pushing against the current with a weight and a patience that made my chest go tight. By the time it reached our side and pulled itself up onto the mud, it was maybe 20 feet from where Sadie stood. It stopped, just stood there, looking. And Sadie, I keep coming back to this, Sadie didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't back up a single step. She just stood in the mud with the cub still wrapped around her, and she looked back. I've had that dog for 9 years. I know every sound she makes, every signal. What she was doing right then wasn't bravery exactly. It wasn't stubbornness. It was something quieter than both of those things. She was just present, still, like she'd already made up her mind about something the rest of us hadn't figured out yet. The cub felt the change before any of us did. I watched it loosen its grip, slowly, like it was testing whether it was safe to let go. It turned its head toward the large gorilla, and something passed between them, some recognition I couldn't name, and then it slid down from Sadie's back and stood in the mud on its own 4 limbs. It took 2 small steps toward the gorilla, then it stopped and looked back at Sadie. That look, I don't have the right words for it. It wasn't fear, it wasn't confusion, it was something closer to the way a child looks back at a stranger who was kind to them, acknowledging that the kindness happened, that it mattered before moving on toward the familiar. I felt something shift in my throat watching it, the kind of shift that catches you off guard when you weren't expecting to feel anything. The large gorilla hadn't moved. It was watching the cub, then Sadie, then the cub again. No teeth, no bluster, no display, just those dark eyes moving slowly, reading everything, the mud, the distance, the way Sadie was breathing, the way the cub was standing. There was an intelligence in that stillness that I wasn't prepared for. This wasn't an animal working out whether to charge. This was an animal working out what had happened. There's a difference, and in that moment I could feel it. The gorilla reached out, not toward Sadie, toward the cub, one large arm extending low and slow, the hand open, fingers loose. The cub moved into it without hesitation, pressed itself against the gorilla's chest, and the big arm came around it gently, not grabbing, holding, the way you'd hold something you thought you'd lost. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding for the last several minutes. That was the moment I understood what I was seeing. This wasn't aggression that had been suppressed. This was a parent, or something close enough to it, standing at the edge of the worst moment of its life, and finding that the thing it feared losing was still there, still whole, still breathing. The others hadn't moved from the far bank, 5 of them, maybe 6, still at the tree line across the water, watching. The air had that particular quality that comes just before something changes, not quite calm, not quite danger, but somewhere in the space between the two. I became very aware of how exposed we were, me standing in the open, Sadie in the mud, a group of wild gorillas no more than a river crossing away, reading the situation with the same careful attention the large one was giving us from 10 feet out. I didn't move, I barely breathed. Sadie took 1 step back, then another, slow, not retreat. Nothing about her posture said retreat. It was more like she was giving them room, creating space without abandoning it. She stopped a few feet back and sat down in the mud, which I know sounds like a small thing, but it wasn't. Sitting down in that moment was the most deliberate signal she could have sent. She wasn't leaving, she wasn't threatening, she was just making herself smaller and waiting. The cub turned again. From inside the circle of that big protective arm, it looked back at Sadie one more time. It was a small thing, just a look, maybe 2 seconds, but it carried the full weight of everything that had happened in the last half hour. The river, the branch, the cold water, the crossing back to shore. The cub looked at Sadie the way you look at someone when you don't have language for what they did for you, but you need them to know you understand it anyway. Sadie didn't move, just looked back, quiet and steady, the way she always is. Then Sadie stood and began walking away from them, back up the slope toward the house. I watched her go, this dog who had just done something I would spend years trying to explain to people, and I thought that maybe that was the end of it. Maybe we'd just walk away and carry this story with us, and that would be all. That's when I heard the sound behind me, a heavy movement, fast. I turned. The large gorilla was moving, directly towards Sadie, covering the ground between them in seconds. The cub still held against its chest, and I felt every muscle in my body lock up at once, because nothing in me was ready for what came next. Everything happened in the space of about 3 seconds. The gorilla covered the ground between them fast, faster than something that size has any right to move, and by the time my brain caught up with what my eyes were seeing, it was already there, right behind Sadie, close enough that I could hear the weight of it landing in the mud with each stride. Sadie heard it too. She stopped walking. Her whole body went rigid, ears up, shoulders tight, and she turned her head just slightly to the side, not fully around, just enough to register what was behind her. She didn't run. I don't know if that was courage, or if she simply understood something in that moment that I didn't. Either way, she held her ground and she waited. I was maybe 15 feet away. I hadn't moved. I'm not sure I could have. There's a particular kind of fear that doesn't make you run. It makes you go completely still, like your body has already calculated that there is nothing useful it can do, and has simply decided to stop. That's what I felt standing there on that muddy bank. My hands were at my sides, my feet were planted, and all I could do was watch. The gorilla reached Sadie in seconds. It stopped, so close now that I could see the rise and fall of its chest, the water still matting the dark fur along its arms. The cub was pressed against it, quiet, watching, and for one long suspended moment, nobody moved at all. Not the gorilla, not Sadie, not me. The river kept running. A bird called somewhere in the trees behind me. The world went on doing what the world does, completely indifferent to what was happening on that small strip of mud. I want to be honest about what I expected. I think anyone standing where I was standing would have expected the same thing. When an animal that size moves toward you, or toward anything, fast and without warning, there is only one story your mind tells you: attack, aggression, danger. Every instinct I had was pointing in that direction. My body was already braced for a sound, a strike, something sudden and violent. I think part of me had already started calculating the distance to the tree line. I think part of me had already said goodbye to Sadie. That's the story I was writing in my head in those 3 seconds. The only story that made sense given everything: the size of the animal, the speed of the approach, the fact that we were two strangers on a muddy bank with no protection and no plan. Everything pointed one direction. Every reasonable reading of that situation pointed one direction. I was wrong about all of it. The gorilla stopped, right behind Sadie, close enough to reach her without effort, close enough that its breathing was audible. A slow, steady rhythm, not labored, not agitated. It just stopped. And then, after a moment that felt much longer than it probably was, it reached out one hand, low, open, the same gesture it had used with the cub a few minutes earlier, fingers loose, palm down, moving towards Sadie slowly, the way you'd extend a hand to something you weren't sure would accept it. It placed that hand on Sadie's back. Not a strike, not a push, a touch, gentle and deliberate and completely, utterly still once it landed. The hand just rested there, between Sadie's shoulders, covering an area roughly the size of a dinner plate, and it didn't move. Sadie didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Her breathing slowed, her shoulders dropped, just slightly, that particular release you see in a dog when tension leaves the body all at once. She lowered her head a few inches and stood there, quiet, beneath that enormous hand. I felt something happen in my chest that I still don't have a clean word for. Not relief exactly, though that was part of it. Something older than relief. Something that felt like watching a door open between two worlds that weren't supposed to connect. The gorilla lowered its head. That's the detail I keep returning to, even now, years later, when I'm sitting on the porch in the evening and the light is going orange over the tree line, and I'm thinking about the things that have mattered most in my life. It lowered its head. Slowly, deliberately, the massive skull dipping forward just a few degrees, not a bow, not quite, but something in that direction, something that carried the unmistakable weight of acknowledgement, of one creature recognizing what another creature had done, and finding some way within the limits of what it had available to say so. I've thought about that gesture more times than I can count. I've turned it over in my mind on long drives and sleepless nights and quiet Sunday mornings. I'm not a sentimental person by nature. I grew up practical, worked practical, lived practical, and I've always been careful about putting human meaning onto animal behavior. I know the risks of that. I know how easy it is to see what you want to see. But I also know what I watched happen on that bank, and I know that whatever that gesture was, whatever category it belongs to in the taxonomy of animal behavior, it changed something in me, permanently. The way a few moments in a life do, if you're paying attention when they arrive. There was no performance in it, no audience it was playing to. It was just true, the way the most honest things usually are. I looked across the river. The others, the ones who had been standing at the tree line on the far bank, still and watchful through all of this, had shifted, not dramatically, but the quality of their stillness had changed. The tension that had been holding them rigid, that coiled alertness that had kept every one of them motionless and forward-facing, had softened. One of them sat down, then another. A younger one moved a few steps back toward the tree line and lost interest, the way young things do when the crisis passes and the world returns to being ordinary. The group exhaled in its own way. Not a sound, just a visible loosening, a collective release that moved through them like a slow wave. Whatever verdict had been reached on that bank, they had all received it, and they had accepted it. Sadie still hadn't moved. The hand was still resting on her back, and she was standing beneath it with a patience and a stillness that I recognized. It's the same quality she brings to everything, the same unhurried presence that made me choose her from the litter 9 years ago, when she was the only one who didn't scramble toward me, but just sat in the corner and watched me with those steady amber eyes until I walked to her. She's always known when to be still. She's always understood somehow that stillness is its own kind of language, that sometimes the most important thing you can say is nothing at all, and the most important thing you can do is simply remain. She remained, and in remaining she completed something. I'm not sure what to call it. A transaction maybe, though that word is too cold. A conversation, an understanding reached without any of the tools we usually rely on for understanding. The cub moved. It had been still against the gorilla's chest through all of this, watching with those wide dark eyes, and now it stepped forward just a few inches, testing the ground, and reached out one small hand toward Sadie. Its fingers found the fur along Sadie's jaw just below the ear, and rested there for a moment. Brief, light, the kind of touch that doesn't ask for anything, doesn't demand anything, it just confirms. You were real. This happened. I remember. Sadie turned her head very slightly toward the cub's hand. Didn't pull away, didn't lean in, just acknowledged it, the way she acknowledges most things, quietly, without drama, as if she'd been expecting it all along. I had to look away for a moment. I'm not ashamed to say that. There are things that are almost too much to watch directly, not because they're painful but because they're so completely unexpectedly beautiful that something in you resists taking them in all at once. This was one of those things. This small hand and that patient face, and the mud and the river sound and the gray morning light over all of it. It was too much and exactly enough, both at the same time. The gorilla lifted its hand from Sadie's back. Slowly. The way you lift a hand from something you're saying goodbye to. Unhurried, like the leaving itself deserves care. It drew the cub back against its chest, turned and began moving toward the river. The others on the far bank were already retreating into the trees, disappearing one by one into the green dark. The young one went first. Then the others, in no particular order, without ceremony. The large one, the one who had crossed the river, who had held the cub, who had placed its hand on my dog's back on a muddy bank on an ordinary Tuesday morning, paused at the water's edge. Just for a moment, it turned its head and looked back at us. Not the long evaluating look it had given us earlier, something shorter than that, something that felt to me less like assessment and more like memory, like it was taking a photograph with whatever it uses instead of a camera. Then it entered the water and crossed back to the other side, steady and unhurried, the current parting around it, and one by one the trees took them all. Sadie watched them go. She stood at the edge of the mud, ears forward, tracking them until there was nothing left to track. Then she sat down in the wet grass, looked up at me once, and looked back at the tree line across the river. I sat down beside her. I didn't have anything to say, neither did she. So we just sat there together in the gray morning, watching the place where they had been, while the river ran on beside us like none of it had ever happened at all. We stayed at the river for a long time after they left. I couldn't tell you exactly how long. Time does a strange thing in the aftermath of something like that. It goes loose and unreliable, but the light had shifted noticeably by the time I finally stood up and brushed the mud from my knees. The gray of early morning had given way to something warmer, a pale gold coming through the trees from the east, laying itself flat across the water in long quiet strips. The river looked different in that light, calmer, less like something that had almost taken a life an hour ago, and more like what it usually was, just a river, running through the morning, carrying whatever it carries. Sadie stood when I stood. She shook herself once, a full body shake, ears flapping, water and mud scattering, and then she looked at me with that expression she has, the one that means she's ready for whatever comes next. That's always been one of the things I love most about her. She doesn't carry things forward the way we do. Whatever happened is finished, and whatever is next is what matters now. There's a lesson in that I've been trying to learn for most of my adult life, and haven't quite managed yet. We walked back up the slope toward the house together, side by side in the wet grass, and I kept glancing back at the tree line across the river. It was empty, still, just trees doing what trees do, indifferent and ancient, keeping whatever they knew to themselves. There was no sign that any of it had happened at all, except for the tracks in the mud at the water's edge, and the way my hands wouldn't quite stop shaking. I've told this story maybe a dozen times over the years, to my daughter, on a long drive once when we ran out of other things to talk about, to a neighbor who asked why I'd started keeping a journal, to a wildlife researcher I met at a public talk a few years back, who listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and then sat quietly for a moment before saying that what I'd described wasn't as unusual as I might think, that there are documented accounts of interspecies behavior that challenge almost everything we assume about the boundaries between animals. He said it carefully, the way scientists say things they want you to hear without misunderstanding, but I could tell it meant something to him too. Most people, when I tell it, go quiet for a moment at the end, not the polite quiet of someone waiting for you to finish, a different kind, the kind that happens when something lands somewhere real and needs a second to settle. I've come to recognize that quiet. I don't try to fill it anymore. I just let it be what it is. What I always come back to every time I tell it is the thing that nobody trained, nobody planned, nobody could have predicted. Sadie didn't jump into that river because she was taught to. She jumped because something in her, something underneath training, underneath habit, underneath the 9 years of domesticated life we'd built together, simply could not watch that cub slip off that branch without doing something about it. There was no calculation, no hesitation, no moment where she weighed the risk and decided the reward was worth it. She was just already moving, already in the water, already committed, before I'd even fully understood what I was seeing. I think about that a lot. The speed of it, the absence of deliberation. We talk about courage like it's something you summon, something you reach for and find or fail to find. But what I watched that morning didn't look like summoning. It looked more like inevitability, like there was never any other option available to her, and the only question was whether the river would let her get there in time. And the gorilla, that's the other half of it that I carry with me. Every assumption I walked into that morning, every piece of received wisdom about what a wild animal does when a strange creature is standing on a bank holding something that belongs to it, was dismantled in the space of about 15 seconds. The gorilla had every reason, by any logic I could construct, to respond with aggression. Size, instinct, fear, protectiveness, all of it pointed the same direction, and it looked at Sadie, and it looked at what Sadie had done, and it chose something else entirely, something that had no survival advantage, something that served no tactical purpose, something that was, as far as I can tell, simply and purely true. I don't know what word belongs to that. Recognition, maybe. Gratitude is a word people reach for, and I understand why, but it feels slightly too small, slightly too human-shaped for what I witnessed. What I saw on that bank was something that lived below language, below category, below the lines we draw between species and intelligence and emotional capacity. It was something that existed before any of those lines were drawn, something much older than the words we'd use to describe it. Sadie is 13 now. She moves slower than she used to. Her back legs have started to go the way they do in bigger dogs at her age, stiff in the mornings, careful on the stairs. She still wants to go down to the river though, not every day but often enough. She'll stand at the door in that particular way she has, patient and certain, and I'll put my boots on and we'll go down together through the wet grass the same way we did that morning years ago, when the world was gray and the water was high and everything that happened next was still ahead of us. I always watch her face when we reach the bank. She'll stand at the edge of the water for a while, looking across, not anxious, not searching, exactly, just attentive, present in a way that is different from how she stands anywhere else. Her ears come forward, and her breathing slows, and she looks at the tree line on the other side with those steady amber eyes, and I never know exactly what she's seeing or remembering or feeling in those moments. I've stopped trying to know. Some things aren't meant to be translated. Some things are only meant to be witnessed. We never saw them again. The gorillas, I've looked on and off over the years, not obsessively, just with the quiet attention you give to something you haven't resolved. Spoken to a few people who know this land better than I do. Nobody has reported a troop in this area since. Whether they moved on, whether that was always just a passing through, whether that morning was as singular for them as it was for me, I'll never know. I've made a kind of peace with that. Not every story gives you its ending. Some of them just give you the moment, and leave the rest to you. But there are evenings, clear evenings in late summer, when the light goes gold over the river, and the air smells like mud and green, and the day cooling down, when I'll be sitting on the bank with Sadie beside me, and I'll feel very distinctly, like we are not entirely alone on that stretch of water. Like something is still present, just out of sight, not threatening, not even asking for anything, just there, the way a memory is there, the way certain mornings stay with you, and never quite let go, no matter how many ordinary days come after them. I don't know what crossed that river that morning. I don't know what moved in Sadie that made her go in without being asked, and I don't know what moved in that gorilla that made it reach out instead of strike. I've sat with those questions long enough to understand that I'm not going to answer them. Not fully. Not in any way that would satisfy the part of me that wants things to be neat and explainable and contained. What I know is simpler than all of that. Simpler, and I think more important. Sadie didn't go into that river to be rewarded. There was no reward waiting on the other side. There was only a cold current, and a small thing losing its grip, and whatever it is, that thing underneath everything else, that makes it impossible to stand on a bank and watch and do nothing. And the gorilla didn't respond with fear. It had every right to. Every instinct it possessed was probably pointing that direction, but it stood on that mud with all of that fear available to it, and it looked at this wet, tired dog, this ordinary golden retriever who had just pulled its cub out of a river, and it found something else, not fear, not aggression, something rarer than both. Understanding. That's the word I keep coming back to. After all the years and all the telling and all the quiet evenings at the water's edge, understanding, the kind that doesn't need language to exist. The kind that passes between living things in a look and a gesture, in the simple act of one creature choosing, against every reasonable expectation, to reach out an open hand instead of a closed fist. I think that's the rarest thing there is, rarer than courage, rarer than strength, the willingness to look at something unfamiliar and frightening and unknown, and to recognize inside it, despite everything, something that you know. Sadie knew it first. She always does.